All right, and it is recording and starting, so I will go ahead and start now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on payment processing for lodging. My name is Iris, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Coordinator for the International Luxury Hotel Association. The ILHA is a nonprofit professional association for individuals and organizations leading the practice, teaching, and development of luxury hospitality worldwide. Our panelists for today are Eric Liebman with Elavon and Tate Coffee. Eric is the Vice President, Head of Product Strategy for Elavon's Travel and Leisure Wing. He works with Elavon's leading hotel and restaurant customers to help conceive, develop, and roll out innovative and effective new products and services to address key challenges in the industry. As I said, we're also joined by Tate Coffee, a relationship manager with Elavon, who has been in the payment solutions business for over 8 years. He works with Elavon's business partners to establish and maintain payment solution programs that provide comprehensive benefits to their members. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen. I'd like to remind everyone that we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. With that said, I'll pass the presentation over to Eric.
Hi, Iris, thank you very much. So I thought I'd start with the basics here and really what we call merchant services. And you may have heard this term before, and really in the world of banking and finance, the merchant is essentially the person who is selling the goods. So that's the retailer or the restaurant owner or the hotel owner, whoever it might be. And a merchant service from the banking world is essentially, we say, providing the electronic payment processing solutions. So we enable the credit card acceptance, the debit card acceptance, the gift cards, and any of those things. So essentially anything that requires electronic transmission to approve or to transact with a customer other than cash. Cash, of course, is still between yourself and the customer. And we have, obviously, in the world of merchant services, back in the old days, it was just Visa and MasterCard and American Express. Now it's the range of credit cards. It includes things like China Union Pay. It includes PayPal. It includes debit services and direct banking things that we call ACH. And there are around the world a multitude of other forms of payment that also are included in merchant service. And essentially that's what we as Elavon provide to our customers in order to allow your customers to purchase from you. So the anatomy of electronic purchase. Well, if you think of it this way, when you insert a card into your payment device, or if you swipe the card, however it is, really we essentially tap our toes or our fingers for a couple of seconds or a minute or whatever it might be, and then we get an approval, and out kind of pumps a little piece of paper that we get our customer to sign. But what goes on in the background of all that is really actually quite interesting. And a lot of it has to do with the transmission between your payment device that sits on your desk and essentially a network like Elavon. And then you have the card brands like your Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and so on. And then you have what we call the issuing bank. And the issuing bank in this case is a term that refers to the bank or the entity that issued the credit card that the person standing in front of you has in their hand. Now, if you have a generic card like a Chase or something like that, then that would be Chase or US Bank. It could be from anywhere specific. But cards can also come from some smaller banks or entities that might only have, just branches in one location, for example, maybe only in Illinois or wherever it might be. So wherever ultimately that card issuer comes from is where the transaction to approve or reject that card will come from. So we send it through ourselves. It goes again through the card brands, so the various types of credit cards. And then it will go again to this issuing bank, and then it comes back to that terminal machine that will say it's either approved or declined. And the approval and declining is based on available credit and available funds. So it's either if it's a debit card, enough funds in the account, or if it's a credit card, enough credit or status of payment, or even status of the card. If the card is stolen or reported lost or whatnot, then those cards will be declined along the way. So that's what happens. The average time to get there and back is about 1.7 seconds. So you can see it's not a long process. Of course, it's always driven by communication lines, but it's a pretty quick process. And of course, we're always looking for ways to make it quicker. All right, so now that we understand sort of what is the anatomy of this acceptance of credit cards in the bank, let's look at how we can manage cost of accepting a credit card. Well, as most of you know, there is a cost when you have a card accepted from a customer to pay for a specific good. In our case, it's a meal. The meal is, let's say, $50, and we have a charge on there for accepting that credit card. Well, the credit card charges range, of course, based on a whole number of variables that we'll talk about in a second. But there are ways to manage those costs. So it's not absolute that you have one number that you pay. And by the way, that number can change based on the transaction. And again, talk about that later. But the overall cost of accepting that form of payment breaks down into three basic components. One is the interchange, and that the interchange is really almost 90% of the total cost of acceptance of a credit card. And that goes to our friends at Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and so forth. And they will essentially use the type of interchange based on the card. Again, we'll talk about later. But as you can see, there are more than 300 categories that change the rates. 300. So you can imagine that there's a wide variance. And so understanding what some of those are will really help you to manage those costs, or at the very least, have them predictable and forecast. Assessments are an additional 9% of the cost. That's now around 99%. And that's also charged by the card brand. And the assessment comes based on the brand usage fee. That means just what Visa or MasterCard tax on there to use their card. And again, I say Visa, Master, but it's all credit cards, Discover, JCB, Diners, American Express, anyone. A cost to access their network, cross-border charges. So that means if someone from the United Kingdom uses their card here in the US, well, there's a charge that the merchant pays in order to accept that card. And then there's high-ticket transaction fees. So something that really goes above and beyond a certain threshold, there are additional fees charged for taking on what the card brands perceive as a risk for that charge. And then lastly, about 1% are the fees charged by folks like ourselves, Elavon, US Bank. And that's really, again, for the same items as assessments, but then we have our charges on there for the use of our network and for the management of your account, because there are a host of things that go on behind the scenes other than just signing up for a credit card. So again, we look at this, 99% of the charges really come from the card brands themselves. So when people talk about accepting credit cards is a high cost, they're really talking about the card brands themselves and the charges that they levy. Okay, so knowing that, what can I actually do to lower or to optimize my interchange costs? Because as I said, it's not an absolute that you pay one number and you're done with the larger processors. Now, if you go with a local or a smaller processor or someone like a WorldPay or otherwise, their fees are going to be a little bit higher, but they are fixed, so they don't change. But the problem is you will always pay that higher fee, probably not the best scenario for business when you can actually lower them. All right, so here are some of the many factors that we look at or that are considered as part of the cost component that can change where your card is issued. So jurisdiction is where the card was basically issued. So certain countries and certain areas can have higher costs than others. There are parts of Asia that have costs that are higher than the US. There are parts of Europe that have it much, much lower. So it really depends, where are you in the world, where are you doing business, and where's the card issued. The type of card. There are, as you've probably seen, we think of, and again, I'll use Visa just as an example, but if you think of a Visa card as being a Visa card, well, actually, a Visa card has so many different iterations because you have Visa Signature, you have Visa Rewards, you have Visa Affinity cards, meaning like a Marriott Visa. You have Visa for Business and Corporate and Visa Debit and all over the place. So the type of card is quite important. The type of business also changes. So if you're in adult entertainment or online gambling or MLM or certain types of higher risk businesses, then your interchange and assessments are going to be higher. Processing environment, so retail, restaurants, you've got lodging, you've got MOTO stands for mail order, telephone order, which of course in these days is really only calling over the phone. And of course, e-commerce, well, each of those has a specific cost. And in many cases, except for the lodging industry, e-commerce has a higher charge, for example, than terrestrial, because there's more fraud online than there is directly at the counter. Addendum data, and that's basically, are we gathering all the information when we capture a card? If you're missing certain types of information, it can add to what the assessment charges are. And then the processing dates. And in our case, typically we do things on the same moment. So when we charge the card, or when we capture the card information rather, we're charging. But in certain cases like cruise lines, hotels, certain types of deferred payments, then the actual transaction date and the date of the actual capturing the payment can be very wide. And the wider those dates are, the higher the costs can be. Now, again, as I said, here are the types of card classifications. In consumer, these are 4 of many. There are many more cards, as I said, affinity cards and whatnot. Then you've got a debit or a check card, which typically have the lowest fees, by the way, of any card. But in certain businesses, again, like lodging and cruise, they're a problem to use in car rental. And then you have a commercial card, which is any kind of business or business-related type thing, where you can have anything from corporate purchasing cards and government and whatnot, up to just your standard, like American Express business corporate card. So understanding these gives us an idea of where some of the different charges are. Third, we have something called downgrades. Now, downgrades, they're a bit of an ugly thing, and really in anything. Nobody wants to be downgraded in anything, I suppose, except as a Florida resident, I can tell you hurricanes getting downgraded is actually a good thing, just saying. But in here, our downgrade means that we're actually going to be downgraded from a lower cost to a higher cost. And the reason for that is, again, either perceived risk, it's not capturing relevant information. So AVS, in this case, stands for Address Verification System. So if you have an address for a cardholder that doesn't match to the address on file, that could create a downgrade. Again, the timeliness of settlement. So if there's a big gap between actually settling, meaning that we actually bill that card from the time that we first got our authorization, missing sales tax, indicators, and whatnot. So again, you can work with your Elavon rep to understand some of these issues. And if you are ever getting downgrades, or to check and say, hey, am I getting downgrades? And then, we'll help you to look at the indicators like the 6 that are here or others that will help you manage a process within your organization that will help you to keep these costs low. So again, to see it, you can really check your statement. Merchant Connect will show you if you've been downgraded. There's something called an EMR report, and all of this, again, you can get directly from your rep to understand. Now, on the assessments, again, these are no fun. If you own a condo, you get an assessment, this is also an equally ugly word to downgrade. And really what it is we want to make sure that you follow the prescribed rules of the card brands to be essentially always aligned with their optimal type of transaction. So you want to make sure that you get authorizations electronically, meaning that we aren't, we're not doing a manual or a forced offline transaction. That will generally cause a downgrade. Card brands don't like to see that type of transaction. Status checks on a card to make sure that a card is an actual valid credit card. A lot of retailers and merchants will do what they call a $1 status check. That's bad because it actually hits the account for $1 of the person. Now, it seems like a very inconsequential amount, but of course, if they do that across a lot of merchants, it adds up. And card brands definitely do not like that. So you should be doing a $0 status check. And then, of course, managing your downgrades is the best way to stay off the radar for Visa. And this one, the location-based fees, tax IDs can affect your assessment fees. So again, something to really check with your Elavon rep on if you're unsure. And the international assessment fees, unfortunately, are charged again when we get overseas customers that come and shop or buy in our restaurants, and they give us a card from the UK or from Singapore or from Australia, wherever they may be. And the way to manage that is through something called dynamic currency conversion, DCC for short. And DCC essentially converts the amount in our currency, in US dollars, into the local currency of the credit card. And that helps us bypass the international assessment fees. So DCC is a fantastic way if you've got international customers coming in, great for the customer, helps you to save costs, And there's also a rev share with some of the premiums that we have on the interchange fees that can be shared with the restaurant. So it's a great kind of win-win. Okay, so let's talk about chargebacks, because I think no conversation about accepting credit cards is really complete without looking at chargebacks and the frauds and the whatnot part of the car. So a chargeback is essentially when a customer uses their credit card to pay for something, and then they consume that product, or they have their meal, or they buy their retail, or whatever it might be, and then later dispute that charge with their card brand. So they'll call up and say, sorry, this charge for $100 in that restaurant, I wasn't there, I didn't authorize that charge, it wasn't me. And the reality is, because the card brands are really, their customer is the customer, our customer, they almost always side with the customers and not the merchants. And the burden of proof is on the merchant to prove that that customer was really there. And in the hotel world, where they moved away from signature on arrival so that you could bypass the front desk and go directly to your room, they were no longer collecting a signature. And the downside to that was they were losing lots and lots of chargebacks. Even when they presented video of the customer in the hotel themselves checking in, they very often lost the case. And it's really, it's a very frustrating and very real part of credit card acceptance are to have these chargebacks. So here's some of the reasons they occur so we can understand how to kind of avoid them from happening. Okay, unauthorized or fraud. Now, in many cases, it really is unauthorized. Somebody got a hold of your credit card and they pirated your number, or you left your purse somewhere and they managed to get your card, whatever it might be. An unrecognized charge. So you see something on there that, like, from DCM Entertainment and somewhere in Nevada or something for a charge for $99. What the heck is that? You can get rid of that. Sometimes, of course, it's just another business name for a company that you bought something from. The merchandise not received, of course, or if it's received and it's unacceptable or damaged or whatnot. So in those cases, again, you'll call your credit card and say, hey, I'm sorry, I never got my stuffed animal. I'm not going to pay for it. Credit requests that are not processed. So sometimes you actually will hit the customer's card, but then you don't process it. It sits on there for a long time. So they may go on and actually charge it back to you, which actually means you have to pay for it. Duplicate charge, which happens sometimes by mistake, sometimes it's a system error, and a subscription canceled but card still not charged. Again, these are just some examples. They're not exhaustive by any stretch, but there's some ways in which this happens. The impact is, in 2016, there was an 8% increase in the cost per dollar of fraud losses. Now, in many cases, when I say chargeback, I'm also referring to fraud, because lots of chargebacks are fraudulent. So people will buy things and then they will charge it back saying, I never received it. Well, that's fraud, and that is actually illegal. Because if you're sitting there with that new bicycle in your garage, but you've gone back to credit card saying, oh, I never received it, and they charge it back to the merchant, essentially that merchant has to pay for your bicycle and you got it free, which is essentially theft, right? It's fraud. And there was an increase in chargebacks, and a lot of this is because they went online with as you can see here in this image, the EMV chip has changed the game with person-to-person, face-to-face fraud, because you cannot duplicate and clone a card anymore. So much of the transactions that are fraudulent are occurring online. Okay, here's some ways on how to avoid chargebacks, and these are always good to know. And again, this presentation will be available online for everybody, so if you want to go back and have a look at these, please do. So mail, phone, and internet transaction, we're not advocating by any stretch that you avoid these. I think they are an absolute way of life in the restaurant business, certainly, and in other businesses. We are just going to have people that are going to want to buy online. They're going to want to call by phone and do things. I can tell you now that Elavon, we are just releasing a new product that allows people to actually call in by phone and order items. And then we have a product that sends an invoice link out to them where they can click online and view an invoice and pay securely, so it's not inconvenient to the merchant. It's very convenient for the customer, and it allows them to pay securely without having to give a number over the phone. Taking credit card numbers over the phone, not such a good thing, or certainly by mail or email or otherwise to write down a number. Internet transactions, again, part of life. Nothing we can really do about that, but the way to avoid it is to control risk. Again, we'd be more than happy to help you with some ideas around how to do this. Anytime you get a request for a receipt or confirmation of transaction, do it quickly, because if someone has asked for a receipt and you don't give it to them, they can always go back to the thing and say, oh, see, I never received the receipt, and they charge it back if they don't have something in their hand. When possible, get a signature on a card, on one of the printouts. Always the best way to fight chargebacks is to have that signature. Can't stress that enough. Make sure you've got your refund or cancellation policies on any receipts or confirmations. Customers need to know where to go if they have complaints, issues, need a refund or whatnot. It's a very, very important thing to have. Dupe transactions is really a workflow issue. It's just making sure that there's a process in place to ensure that that doesn't happen, that there's a check and balance to ensure that this hasn't been charged before. If you've been declined, don't try and force it through as an offline transaction, because chances are it's going to be a high risk of chargeback from that customer. Again, recurring payments, you don't want to let them lag. If they go, that will be an instant chargeback. And the chargebacks, by the way, and I don't know if I've mentioned this earlier, there is a cost to the merchant for every chargeback. So this is why we're stressing it so highly. And if the chargeback volume increases beyond a certain level, the card brands can fine you for the chargebacks, and then going even further, can ultimately bar you from using credit cards if the chargebacks persist. Okay, and then lastly, the last couple of things, ensure the card number is displayed match, and then lastly, make sure that any merchandise that you're sending to a customer is obviously in good shape and arrives on time and as promised. You can't avoid all chargebacks, you can't avoid all fraud for sure, but these are ways to mitigate at least the risk of having chargebacks. Okay, let's talk for a minute about EMV and data security. So we're really talking about this, and it was important to really make sure that everybody understands, what the benefits and the sort of the truths and falses of EMV, the chip cards, are. So as many people know, November 2016, they came into full force. Actually, that was October 2016. And so here's some of the kind of truths and myths here. It does mitigate counterfeit fraud at the point of sale. And the way it does that is because we can no longer clone credit cards. So it's a little tougher to counterfeit a credit card. And it creates a different PMS or point of sale experience, simply because instead of handing my card over to a clerk or an agent or a waitress or whoever now to manage the card, I actually keep the card in my hands at all time, and I insert it in the machine myself. And I know in my grocery store, it took me the longest time to not hand my card over to the cashier when she was getting me checked out. She kept saying, nope, you got to do it, and putting it in myself. Now, on the false side, it's not mandated, so you don't have to do it. And I'm sure many of you out there have not done it yet, so there's no mandate to do it. However, if you do not convert over to EMV in your place of business, you are liable for fraud, for card fraud costs. So the costs are passed back onto you. If there is fraud and you are EMV, in many cases, you are not liable for those costs. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, protects against card not present fraud and commerce. That's the card not present is the other word for e-commerce. No, it does not protect against that. EMV is not fully enabled online. It does not prevent a data breach, and it does not require a PIN. In most places in the world, they have the chip card and the PIN, and you've heard that maybe called chip and PIN. In the United States, we have chip and signature, meaning that you only have to sign like you did your normal credit card with the card. Probably the chip and PIN is the more safe variant of EMV, but in this country, we've opted to go with signature. And by the way, fraud has gone down. Visa just came out with stats said there, I believe it's 70% less fraud now than there has ever been. Okay, and it eliminates the need for magnetic stripe. Again, false, because not everybody is enabled for EMV, and so if not, you need a backup plan to accept the credit card using the stripe, so you still swipe. So you'll see machines have both a swipe and an insert area in order to do both. Now, what are some of the threats? Well, everybody knows about, I'm sure you've all heard of the word phishing. The big and most, I guess, concerning of all the threats is the point of sale malware, which is responsible for most of the breaches that have happened, which is essentially that the fraudsters get a hold of some code that they managed to get inserted into the point of sale core system, and that allows them to start capturing credit card numbers and details and PINs and all kinds of stuff. It's a real problem, and the challenge is that the fraudsters are spending as much time and money or more than the good guys like us at the banks are trying to do to defend it. So we're always kind of in this neck and neck race to see who's actually ahead of who. And they're still out there. So I'm sure all of you have heard of the major ones, but I'm sure many out there that are still brewing. So it's always important to make sure that you practice security, both from a hardware perspective, and that's what Elavon brings with our safety and our simplified solutions, but also from a software, soft person, from a resource perspective, to make sure that things like PINs are always kept, login PINs are kept secure, that keys are never given out to enter any of the hardware stuff, that there are no USB ports enabled on any of the machines that carry a point of sale and PMS and whatnot. So there are many ways to prevent against this, both in your hardware and again on your actual your folks, your employees. So we at Elavon talk about what we call a layered security protocol, and this we feel is the best and the most robust way to protect cardholder data, because nobody wants to be a headline in the news to say so-and-so was breached, so many records were stolen, this and that. There are tremendous fines, there are tremendous issues. It's just all in all not a great thing. So our three layers, are EMV, that's the chip card, encryption, which is ensuring that the data that we call that's in flight is encrypted into meaningless gobbledygook, and then tokenizing the numbers so that the credit card number, the 16 or 15 digit numbers that pass through the system are in fact converted into seemingly random series of numbers that are translatable if you've got the key. And of course, the key is maintained by the banks of the world like US Bank and Elavon. And so when you have EMV to prevent counterfeits, the cards that you're using are good, you encrypt the data as it's moving across. So if anyone actually caught the stream of information moving, they couldn't pull anything meaningful out of it. And thirdly, even if they did capture the stream, the card number that was embedded in there is completely meaningless to anyone. So it's a pretty secure way of ensuring cardholder data safety. Now, again, at the point of sale, we talked about EMV. Very important. If you're not EMV already, if you are concerned about data security, the best thing to do is to have an EMV-enabled terminal and stay with it and stay vigilant. So an implementation strategy for EMV really is to look and see where are there any vulnerabilities within your business and ensure that everything is locked down and secure. Again, there should be no hard copies. I know there are a lot of hotels that actually print out what they call credit card authorization forms, where they've got names, addresses, they've got the actual card number, the CVV, the expiry date, a signature, everything on a piece of paper that they print out and keep in folders in an office. And that's at high risk of being compromised. So look around and ensure that your whole environment is secure. Find a provider that really understands your particular business. Make sure they know what your business is in, so the nuances are at least known to them, and that they have the experience and a long-term plan for continually, staying ahead of the fraudsters. Again, in the case of Elavon and US Bank, we've been in EMV because we have a big European presence since 1994. So we've been out there for 24 years or so. So find people who really understand EMV and can help you mitigate all the risks. And then prepare the hotels, and this was done for hotels, I apologize, but prepare your business really by looking at this and adopting a culture of security and understanding that the cost of the business is so catastrophic if you are breached that it's better to be prepared and better to be vigilant than it is to certainly to be lax and hope that it just doesn't happen to you too. All right, I want to talk a little bit about converged hospitality. Now, for I guess every hotel, we talked a little bit earlier about the credit card authorization form. So most of the hotels on here will probably be familiar with the fact that when someone calls you up and says, "Hey, my brother is staying in your hotel and it's on his wedding night, and I would really like to put a bottle of champagne in his room. So what do you want to do if he wants to, and you say, I want to pay for his whole stay, coming for a weekend and just charged by card? What if you work for business and you have an employee visiting your head office and you want to put them up in a hotel that's next to your office? What if you want to pay for your wedding reception, right? You're getting married and you're having it at a hotel that's maybe where the groom's family live, and you're going to do it there. You're not local, right? Again, put a bottle of champagne in your friend's room on check-in. Or you have a membership like golf or a fitness club or a dining club or something where it's a recurring monthly thing. Again, now what's done by hotels, and many of you will probably relate to this, is that they send out that credit card authorization form, and that form is filled out as mentioned with all that details, and then it's kept somewhere in a file somewhere, and then it's charged. From a chargeback perspective, it is helpful because now you have the information in the signature that you can always go back to and say, well, you signed for it. On the downside is if you're ever audited by PCI or otherwise, that could be a whole world of trouble, because having that kind of data available is a massive risk. So what you would do now if you want to do any of those is you would call a hotel. They would send you the authorization form, you put it all out, and they print it, and they store it for 7 years. That's what typically do. Now we have something we call Converge Hospitality. And so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this. I mentioned earlier that we had this solution that allowed you to send out an invoice. And really what the invoice does is it takes the credit card out of the environment of your hotel, and it puts it in Elavon's hosted and secure environment. So when anyone does any of the scenarios that I mentioned earlier in the hotel, what they're looking to do is pay for something remotely. And so we call these people third parties, right? Because they're the people, they could be a meeting planner, they might be a corporate booker for a local business, they could be, again, a friend or relative doing it on behalf of an arriving guest, or it could be, in some cases, yourself. You're the third party, but you're also the first party. If you're doing like a wedding reception, or you're going to do a meeting or a conference or something like that you're attending. And we have really two flavors of those charges. One is an amenity, like the bottle of champagne or dinner or some flowers or chocolates in a room. And then we have room-related charges, which is, again, your meeting rooms and your suites or your certain whatever. So there are two distinct types. Okay, so now Converge Hospitality changes the game a little bit now from calling a hotel and sending in that credit card authorization form. Now we call the hotel. The hotel will enter the information into Converge Hospitality. Converge Hospitality captures email and address and all the information about the customer and about what it is that they'd like to pay for. And it generates an email with a mini invoice and a link to an online version of that invoice. Once the third party clicks on it and views the invoice, they can, again, confirm everything's correct on the invoice, and then they click a button to pay now. So then they use their credit card, much as you would in any e-commerce transaction. And Elavon hosts that payment interface so that the hotel only knows the invoice is sent out and the money is sent to the hotel within 1 or 2 days, whatever the typical turnaround time is. So now we've managed to accept the payment. The customer's been able to view the invoice and pay. And if there's anything they want to dispute or question, they can call the hotel back before they pay. Excuse me. And then the credit card payment is done remotely. So now the hotel does no longer have to capture that information over the phone and print it out. Okay, so how would that work? So Mary would call the hotel, request a bottle of champagne, put in her best friend's room. The hotel agent, Susan, takes the information down, and she captures Mary's contact details and the arrival date of her best friend. Logging into Converge Hospitality, she enters all that information into a secure form that we host. And Converge Hospitality again sends an email to Mary's inbox containing a link to the invoice. Once Mary clicks on the invoice, she enters her card details, and she's good to go. So now a much more secure and much more convenient way of doing this. And by the way, Converge Hospitality will ultimately be able to accept all the different forms of payments and different currency types in later iterations. So it will be able to grow with your customer base as your customer base grows. So what are the benefits? Well, digital invoicing. Everything's now captured on digital. Customer has a copy, you have a copy. Converge maintains a copy for more than a year. You have automatic payment processing and confirmation. So now we're not entering this into a PMS. We're not putting it into manual enter, what we call it keyed in into the terminals. It's done directly through the cloud, and it eliminates that wonderful PCI risk that we're all hoping to get rid of. So who's the right customer for Converge Hospitality that we lovingly call Coho? It could be a large convention hotel, right, where you're booking lots and lots of conventions. And within conventions, you have kind of side conventions. So you have, let's say, the organization of carpet sweepers, but then within that, they have Acme Carpet Sweeping has a hospitality suite. And another company has a poolside barbecue and all these other things where they want to have separate functions within a major function. Again, you can capture that and send the invoice out to those function planners so that they can pay for it in advance. A resort hotel where there are a lot of people who go on honeymoons and on anniversaries and birthdays and special events and whatnot. Mid-sized hotels, any kind of hotel where I can call up and I want to pay for someone else's room. Not everybody stays in a large hotel. Sometimes they stay in the mid-sized hotels. Even smaller hotels, because Coho can be used for things like bus tours. So if you have a bus tour coming to your hotel and they want to, they book a bunch of rooms in your hotel, well, you can use Coho to capture your deposit. Or snowbirds who may come down, if you're in the south and they're in the north, they want to come down to use it, they too can do it. And essentially, any meeting, banquet, or event venues, so conference halls and any kind of a local organization or association that has meeting space, they can also use it for any planned meetings. Okay, so that wraps up my section. I hope it's been informative and fun for you today. And so I'd like to now hand over to Tate Coffey, the relationship manager, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his role. So Tate, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. So we are very excited to have a partnership with ILHA. And so what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about who we are as Elavon. Elavon, first and foremost, is owned by U.S. Bank. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of U.S. Bank. So we have the full strength and backing of a large organization. We are in the top 5 in the U.S. for processors. And more importantly, here is we are top 5 in hospitality. So we understand the lodging business, right? So next slide. And then for this partnership, what we've been able to do is make sure that we have all of our most common features that are available to all customers, with the addition of customizing some things for ILHA members. So full-time customer care. So we have 24/7 support by phone. We are always there to assist if there's an issue. Each customer is assigned a customer account managers, and the customer account manager is essentially your liaison at Elavon. They're here to assist with any complicated issues that might arise, make sure that you are processing correctly. They will review your interchange, make sure that we're not missing anything as far as how you're processing. They can consult with you and advise. They'll help you get established in your processing account so they can kind of ease some of the burden as you're making a switch from one processor to us. And of course, we have no early cancellation penalties. So our thought process is we're going to do the right thing. We're going to do a great job. You're not going to want to leave us. If we don't do it, we stand behind that and we don't charge you to leave. So there is no reason for you to want to leave us, is what we hope. If there ever is, we're not going to penalize you for doing so. So we do have a special for ILHA members, and that special is that Elavon is going to waive implementation fees. So as we look at creating a customized processing solution for you, if there is implementation fees, we're going to waive those up to $2,500. And then in addition to that, ILHA will provide 1 year of membership free. So even if you're currently a member, you get the added benefit of getting a year's worth of credit added to, so you can continue on and receive that credit. So that is for the first 20 ILHA members who sign up. So we hope to hear from some of you today. Next slide, please. And then when you're ready to get into more of a detailed solution, Timothy will be most happy to talk to you. Timothy is very well educated in the lodging and processing industry. He's worked in that field for several years and has a great knowledge of not only processing with Elavon and beyond, but the lodging industry itself. So that's all I have for today. So I will turn it back over.
All right, thank you so much, Tate. I do see that we have some questions that have come in. If anybody has any questions to ask, you can do so in the chat window. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first question from Allison, who's asking about the price of Converge Hospitality.
Great question. We have a range of prices based on the size of the property. So based on the number of rooms within the property as defined in the size. And then we have one for sort of ultra large resorts. So there are 4 tiers. They're all, I can tell you, not knowing the size of your property, the best thing to do is contact Timothy and he'll be happy to share the pricing with you, but it's very low. It's the best I can tell.
Okay, perfect. Jim wants to know, how long does it take to establish an account through Elavon?
Sorry, Eric, I'll take that one. So yeah, again, Timothy will be able to assist and move that process along. There is an application that he will assist in completing, making sure we have all the viable information. One of the first things he will do is look at your processing today, look at how you do things within each location, and make sure to put together the right plan for you. Then the application process. Typically after the application is submitted, it's only a couple of days, and then we'll look at implementation and we'll schedule that out to make sure that it works best for you, depending on your needs and what your busy season may be, or if you know you have something, a large event coming up, certainly we wouldn't want to make any changes, but we will work with that schedule and make sure that it's done with you in mind.
Perfect. We have a question from Amy, and it says, how can I save money on my credit card transactions?
I think that's a great question. I think it's probably not a one sentence response. So I would say, please take a look at this presentation again. I think there were a lot of really great examples of how to manage assessments, to understand the different charges for the different cards that you accept. So sometimes you can promote a particular type of card, for example, that may help. Again, debit cards and lodging, probably not the greatest thing, but it may be something that you're okay with, and those charges are lower. And certainly the downgrades and the chargebacks are really, it's a culture of understanding how to manage card transactions to best avoid those. So I think, again, not to throw everything back at Timothy, but he's not here, so what the heck? So I would suggest that give Timothy a call, and he'll be glad to talk with you and give you some more concrete examples, and maybe look at your particular hotel and understand how we can, if there are areas that we can focus on to save you money.
All right, thank you. We have another question asking about Coho. They want to know, does it integrate with any PMS?
Yeah, that's a great question. So by design, it does not. And the reason for that is because if you look at the IHLA, for instance, the ILHA, I always get that backwards, I'm sorry. It is really, it's a case of if every hotel that had a different PMS had to integrate with Coho, we would be spending every day of every month of every year just building integrations to each one. So we've made it deliberately standalone so that regardless of what property management system that you're using, or what POS you're using, and even what processor you're using. So you may be an Elavon customer, you may be a Chase customer. It doesn't matter because Coho is standalone and you can still use it and use the services without necessarily having to have any, again, a certified PMS or even to have our processing service.
Okay.
Okay.
We had another question. Can I use Converge Hospitality for my small tour groups?
Yes, absolutely. As mentioned, it's a great way to accept deposits or take payment for the groups. So when they come in, generally speaking, you block the rooms, then a certain days before arrival, you're going to accept some kind of a deposit or a deposit on booking, and then balance before or after. Whatever you want to do to set up, you can do. So you have the flexibility to send the invoices for payment at any time. And then the system allows you to track. So not only do you get to send out these invoices for payment, but you can track and see if it's been unpaid, and then have the system send reminders, or you can physically send reminders and then continuously view the status of the payment. So it's a great way to not only, invoice these the deposits and whatnot, but certainly to keep up to date with the status of payment.
Yeah, it sounds like a great feature. And I'm going to see if there's any last questions. Cynthia wants to know, how can I best control downgrades from a credit card?
I think, again, probably a bit more of an in-depth answer. So again, just maybe talk to Timothy and ask him about your particular hotel, and maybe we can review some of the charges that are there in the hotel. And if you have international guests, for example, the dynamic currency conversion, DCC, would be a great way to avoid those downgrades for all those transactions. And just again, there are a handful of probably very simple ways to ensure that you're having as clean a transaction as possible that don't attract downgrades. So again, invite you to have a look at the presentation online, and then I'll give our friend Timothy a call.
All right, great. I don't see any more questions, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar for today. As we mentioned earlier, this will be available online on our website.